I'm Nick Lippa, reporter for WBFO News and lead reporter for our mental health initiative. And today I am so grateful to be here with two very ambitious and active 22-year-olds, Kaitlyn, Ledzian, and Julianna Hill, who are youth peer advocates with Mental Health Advocates of Western New York. We're here talking about mental health today, and it can be really hard to talk about mental health issues, especially when dealing with it at a young age. So first off, I want to talk about, how did you get involved with peer advocacy?
So I actually got involved at the time I was going to ECC. I was getting my human services certificate, and I was looking for an internship. So I actually knew somebody who was working at the MHA at the time. They got me the internship, and I was there for probably about 3 months. And a few months after that, I was hired as a youth peer advocate. So.
And how about yourself?
So actually, I was introduced to my current supervisor at a gift wrapping party that was done by NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness. And I went with my mom, and we were introduced to her there. But I didn't actually go and talk to my supervisor until about 4 months later afterwards to get more involved with doing peer advocacy work.
So tell me a little bit about your backstory, because there's a lot of reasons that have brought you to where you are today. What's driven you to come to this point where now you're 22 and you're doing more work? How did you become active in this organization?
Well, I had gone through the mental health system probably starting at around the age of 14 or 15. I was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, with major depressive disorder, and with an eating disorder, all around the same period of time. And I had gone to a psychologist, a psychiatrist. I had received wraparound services, which are home and community-based services with a care coordinator team. And I had trouble with going to school. I ended up being hospitalized for about a period of 4 months and going to an alternative school. And throughout the whole process, I had never actually been able to talk to anyone who was in recovery. The closest thing I had to peers were the other patients in the hospital with me, and we can't really help each other, much less ourselves. And then there were the staff and your family members who they say they understand, but at the same time, it's like, well, you're not in a hospital, you've never been in the hospital before in this kind of circumstance. So I always really felt kind of alone, and I didn't really feel comfortable even bringing it up to my friends at school. And so when I heard about doing work like this, I was like, oh, this would have been great for when I was in the hospital. I wish it was, because I think it would have really helped me be able to, first off, express myself better and want to be more engaged and working towards goals that, were more realistic and that I could actually meet them. So that's why I like doing the work I do.
And you talk about feeling alone in that instance. Is that a feeling that each of you see a lot being youth advocates right now?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that, for me at least, when I was, going through the mental health system, my parents especially, we didn't know about a lot of resources around. So that was a really big struggle for us. My sister had dealt with mental illness herself, so I kind of grew up in the mental health world already. So I think having a youth peer advocate for me would have been amazing, because I would have been able to relate to somebody else. I could relate to my sister in a way, but she was going through her own things at the time. So I definitely feel like I wish I would have had someone to talk to and just been like, I get it, I understand. So I think that's a really big key point. And also, we're closer in age to these youth. So like you said, we're both 22, and, the youth that we work with primarily are teenagers and then up to, 26. So it's really easy, we know what's relevant, we know what's going on, and then also we know about the services around, so.
Is it more difficult to talk to somebody that's your own age too about these problems when you're in the moment? You mentioned, I have a sister, but she was going through her own stuff. Is it harder to, like, even when you feel comfortable opening up with somebody, to be able to get into that with somebody your own age versus having somebody that's maybe a little bit older that's close enough in age to relate to about some of these issues?
I mean, I think depending on the situation. So if I had a youth come to me, and it was a part of my job, it is definitely a little bit easier on my end, because we have gone through our fair share of trainings and, all of that. But for the youth, I still think it is a little difficult to start that conversation no matter who it is. So I think that's why it's just a little bit easier for them to talk to us. If it was like an outside person out of work, like a friend or a family member, it still can be a little difficult because, as much as we do this work, some people just don't know. You know what I mean?
Or
It's
don't
not
care.
it's not like we have it tattooed on our foreheads like, hi, my name's Kaitlyn, I have a mental illness, like, you know what I mean, to everybody I meet. So I can see somebody struggling and I want to reach out. So it definitely, there's a little bit of a barrier there, like that disclosure part is super big.
And then you have the family as well when you're dealing with, and what are some of the challenges that you see? You mentioned a little bit on it, dealing with people from an older generation, and sometimes there are people who are set in mind about how things are, how treatment should be handled. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing right now from a generational aspect?
I feel like a lot of parents, when they grew up where everything was very taboo, very hush-hush. We've become much more open with this generation, not just about mental health, but about several different topics and things like that. But it kind of depends on, when it comes to the older generation, how willing they are to become open-minded and come in with no judgment and just be willing to learn. And because, around the time that they were growing up was around the time when there were still asylums, institutions, where people went and they stayed for the rest of their lives. And so many things have changed since then. And I don't think they really realize how much it has changed. Like, before I was put in the hospital, I had a full idea that I was going to be in a straitjacket, and it absolutely was not that. So it has to just do with if they're willing to support you and if they're willing to learn and grow with you as they go through this.
And what happens, though? Let's say I'm a 15-year-old person right now, and right now I don't have the resources right now within either my household or my support group around me that puts me in a position to where I can go ask to get some of that help. What would you say to somebody who's 15, 16, kind of in an environment necessarily that isn't supportive of going to get help?
So a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of things online. Our work specifically, we have a Just Tell One campaign. So it really talks about finding your trusted person, whether that be your parents, a friend, a coach, a church leader, whoever it is, finding that one trusted person to kind of just reach out to and say, hey, I'm going through a rough spot and I just need someone. So justtell1.org is amazing. Also, for individuals who are over 18, you can always call the Warm Line. And that is a phone service. It's also peers like us, but they're also trained in mental health as well, so they can reach out if they just need an ear to talk to. And of course, crisis services. If you ever feel like you are in danger of hurting yourself or others, you can always reach out to the nearby crisis services hotline.
Yeah, and when you're going through that, though, too, are there steps to move forward where you can work things out with a guardian or a parent to try to work on being able to get to these services as well, and working with your family to understand what's happening as well?
I think it has to do with, first you have to get the parents on board, which can probably be one of the most difficult things that I've seen, at least that I've seen with the youth that I work with, is a lot of them say that, like, my parents don't believe me, they think I'm doing it for attention. And so they won't take it seriously when they say, I want to be on medication, or I want to, go to therapy, or if they start threatening suicide or something like that, and they really feel suicidal, and their parents are saying, oh, you're just doing this to do it. So the main issue to really work out is to decrease the stigma around mental health and how it has changed, and then education really about the resources that are out there, because there can be a lot of preventive preventative resources as well as intervention ones as well. So I know like a lot of parents can think that it's either to one extreme where you're just immediately in the hospital, but there can be so many other steps beforehand, like going to a therapist or going to a simple support group, like support groups that we do in the community, or even just getting involved with organizations that just have after-school community programs just to get them engaged more and working with other youth can all really help impact with that.
And I know the message sometimes, when you're talking, can be a little bit difficult to somebody who's hesitant to accept that. If I go to the doctor's, I break my leg, the doctor goes, oh, he's got a broken leg. It's pretty straightforward. But you're talking about somebody who is a teenager, and they say, something's wrong with me, I don't feel good. And it's not something that can be diagnosed for somebody who is a teenager right away. So it's a little bit more harder to put into words or put a label on for somebody to accept. And I wanted to ask that, how does it feel potentially being diagnosed when you are coming from a youth perspective into adulthood with something that you might have been battling with for years and years now?
Yeah, so for me, I have gone through a bunch of different diagnoses. I was originally diagnosed with depression and anxiety, along with borderline personality disorder. So borderline personality disorder is not, I don't have multiple personalities, that's not it. It's more so just about having problems with, emotion regulation, interpersonal relationships, things like that, self-esteem. So those were my original diagnoses. Also, learning disorder, not otherwise specified, they like to say, because I don't fit into a specific category. So now as I've gotten older, so specifically with youth, it's hard to identify because, like you said, their brains are still developing, especially with mood disorders. A mood disorder was always talked about with my psychiatrist and my family. It's genetic in my family. So I was diagnosed with bipolar 2 when I was 19 years old. I was going to just an outpatient clinic through the Buffalo Psychiatric Center, and they diagnosed me there. I was diagnosed officially with generalized anxiety disorder. I was experiencing a lot of panic attacks, and still do, and then also PTSD. So it was really hard. Sometimes you just want a label as much as you don't, because it just explains everything, and you can finally identify with a community of people, which I think is really important because, a lot of people who deal with mental illness have a loss of identity. And they don't really know where they fit in. They feel alone and isolated, like we said before. So for me, finally getting those labels and saying, you know what, like, I have this and that's okay, I think was really important for me, at least.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a little bit of a comfort when you get to a standpoint. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I'd say so. I know at first when I was diagnosed, I was probably confused, at least with the depression, because that one didn't really make sense at the time, because I was actually diagnosed before I ended up going into my first major depressive episode. But the other ones was like, oh my gosh, especially the anxiety disorder. Like, I probably, if I had gone to someone much younger, I probably would have been diagnosed around like age 6, because like, I just go back and like, that's why I just felt so terrible, even though I was just going over to a friend's house. So like, why does my stomach hurt so much? Yeah, and so it made sense because I never told anybody, because I'm like, how do I explain that I'm going to my friend's house, but like I'm stuck in the bathroom? Like,
yeah, like I want to hang out with my friends, but there's all these unfamiliar people around me in this area, and I didn't really know. Yeah, no, I think for me too, going back, I remember I started counseling when I was actually around like 8 years old, because my parents were like, okay, something's a little up. So we were kind of banking on the learning disability thing for a while. So we went, and my parents kept some of the papers and like the worksheet activities and stuff, and actually got to look at them a few years ago when I first started as a YPA. And looking at, the thoughts and, the darkness that I had as an 8-year-old, and then looking at pictures of me was so weird. So I definitely think that I was a really depressed child. I just had different outlets at the time. I was really involved with extracurriculars, you know what I mean, extracurriculars. I can never, that in specific, anyways, and sports for sure. So I had different outlets, but as I got older, I started to lose that interest in those activities. So I think that's really when it became prominent and it was visible.
I can imagine socially that there's so many of those instances. I mean, you harken back to a moment, in your adolescence, that something like this, when you start to ask questions and say, what's happening with me, it helps resolve some of that. And I do want to ask that because there are a lot of kids out there who don't get that kind of help. Where would you see yourself without getting the help that you needed?
That's a really scary thought,
Yeah.
to be honest. I can't say without the supports that I had in place, I don't know if I would honestly even be here. I was, through my teenage years especially, I was going through a lot of impulsive and like irrational behaviors, shoplifting, drug use, eating disorder behaviors, just anything that made me feel something, because for so long I was feeling nothing. Self-harm, suicidal ideation, anything. So without those supports that I had in place, I really don't think that I would have successfully graduated from high school. I don't think I would have even thought about college or really anything. Again, like I said, I don't know if I would even be here. So it's just that stress of how important it is to kind of come forward and, let people know how you are feeling, I think.
Yeah. Same for you?
Pretty much. I know that my depression was very numbing. I stayed in bed day in and day out. I was suicidal, but I was so depressed that I couldn't actually even make a plan, do anything. My hope was to rot in bed. And if I hadn't gotten the help, I probably would still be in bed. Yeah.
And it's one of these things, again, really grateful to have you here and talking about this, because this is not an easy subject to talk about for anybody, especially talking about youth, which, again, this is on the rise when we talk about anxiety, depression, and very scary suicide. It's been a serious issue. One of the things I wanted to go back to and touch on as well was labeling, because while it can be comforting in the fact where it's like, I finally know what's wrong with what's going on, what is happening with me, when you want to put it on there. Do you work with people who are afraid of getting that label when they hear it? They're like, oh, I don't want this label. I don't want, or maybe they're rejecting even care because they don't want to even have the possibility of getting that label.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also with the stigma, like Julie said. It's really just breaking down that stigma. I also see it a lot with it culturally too. I think is really a really big thing that no one kind of establishes, is that we always say the older generation is very hush-hush and, they really don't want to talk about it. We keep whatever's going on in the home. I remember a lot of times when my sister was first dealing with mental illness, it was always, she's sick, she's sick. And we never really said why or what was happening, because we weren't sure how people would react. And the few people that we did tell, maybe they weren't, the best supports for her at the time. So I definitely think that breaking down that stigma is very, very important. So just like this, having a conversation and being open and honest with other people, for sure.
Yeah, and with that, we talk about breaking the stigma. We seem to be having more of these conversations in 2019 comparative to where we were 20, 30 years ago. But why do we see a rise, do you think, in mental illness when it comes to things like anxiety, depression, and suicide with youth?
I feel like definitely part of it has to do with just how far we've come in terms of like technology today. A lot of people talk about like social media with like cyberbullying and things like that, because the drama doesn't stop anymore at the end of the school day, and that can still like follow you as you go. And then also just the fact that we have so much access to media everywhere, that we're hearing stories of violence here, suicides here, this, that, and then it also just makes you like kind of scared almost. Just be like, could this happen to me? Could I be potentially influenced by this and like get it that way? I feel like my mom, when I was like in middle school, I had a friend who was like very suicidal, and I didn't really know how to help her at all. And my mom didn't want me to hang out with her because she was a bad influence. And at the same time, I was like, well, she's not going to make me want to do any of this stuff. I'm just trying to help her. But it puts those thoughts into your head too, like, what if they are secretly influencing me in some way? So.
And then, when you look at this issue and you see some of these anxiety on the rise, depression on the rise, why do you think that is with youth as well? You talk about concern from older parents as well, and that definitely, I can see that if you're somebody who's just trying to take care of their kid. But as well, you see this, you guys have been advocates and you've been through this program. Why do you think it's on the rise from your perspective?
So like Julie said, I definitely think that social media has an influence. So we were kind of the generation that grew up on like MySpace and Facebook. So that was the beginning of social media. And then I remember buying my first smartphone, the Android, right? And then getting the iPhone. And, a lot of times school districts really can't do anything when you go home because it's off school grounds, it's out of, you know what I mean? So a lot of kids were just going home. I remember being cyberbullied a lot. I dealt with bullying when I was younger, in elementary and school and whatnot, but like really in my high school years, it was just constant fighting and drama and name calling. And after a while, it really just took a toll on me. So I think not only social media, but again, like Julie said, just we're more open, we're more vocal. We're not afraid to say, like I don't feel good, this isn't right. Just about any sort of, I think really any sort of social justice issue. I think we're very vocal about all of that.
So it's fair to say you see a rise in some of these issues, but part of it just might be more people are listening. You're hearing more people come out.
Yeah.
And you hear that a lot about things, not even just with mental illness, but things like Alzheimer's, where you have more people coming out. Oh, well, we're diagnosing it better. We're doing these things, which is really interesting to me. Now, I'm curious about this. When you talk about social media, there are certain things where I go through high school, I was going through Facebook. You talk about MySpace and Facebook. I'm actually surprised I'm hearing about MySpace. You guys are 22. I'm glad it hung on for that long. But
right at the end.
Right at the end.
Right. Yeah.
But really, is there things that you're seeing now where you're working with somebody who's 15 or 16 now, 5-6 years later, where there are social media aspects that are even newer to you at this point that you didn't have to deal with 6 or 5 years ago?
A lot. I remember a lot of these apps were coming out, so like Instagram and Snapchat. It was fun, it was fresh, like it was cool. But really, I feel like Snapchat, and there's a new app called Musical.ly, and people can, record themselves lip singing or dancing, and, a lot of people are getting bullied on there. There's compilations of videos from people on these Musical.ly or TikTok apps, and they're putting all of what may seem like cringy or funny, but these people are just being themselves. So, it may be silly or whatever, but we don't know how that person feels on the other side of the phone or the tablet. So really, I think like Snapchat is really big right now. Instagram, I really think, and like that TikTok app for sure. Like I know nothing about it, but I have a 17-year-old sister. She's going to be a senior next year. So she like keeps me informed all the time, because I'll be like, there was a youth today and they brought something up. She'd be like, oh yeah, it's that. And I'm like, oh, thank God for you, man. Honestly.
And it's just amazing to hear that, because we talk about it and you're trying to get somebody who's a 45-year-old mother to empathize and try to understand what's happening. And here we are, 6-7 years, and it's like, oh, here's this new app, and I'm just 6 years removed.
Yeah.
And I think it's, again, fascinating to me, and we talk about how fast all of this moves, and that's something that's entirely new that goes with it. So we know social media plays an impact when it comes to a rise in some of the things and factors that we didn't have to deal with in the past, but also what are some other things that people might not pick up on that can cause mental health problems for people who are young? Are there economic factors, or what comes up?
Yeah, I definitely think economic, for sure, or any, like I mentioned before, culturally. So anyone that's, in or belongs to a community of minorities, I think is really big, because we talk about, for example, PTSD, right? So immediately you think of war veterans. You look at me and you're like, she didn't serve in the war, and you're right, I didn't. But I had, traumas that happened to me. that not, maybe not an average person would experience. So for example, these people in the minority communities, they're experiencing a lot of violence in the homes, or gun violence, or, poverty, and that can be really traumatic for a child to go through, and then have to, try to come up out of that community is really, really hard. So I definitely think, economic factors, and I also think like trends too. So I think of like when I was younger, I remember different trends, like I was coming up on, for example, I was using drugs a lot when I was younger. So I don't really hear about certain things, like the opioid epidemic is so big right now. But before, it was kind of like I never knew anyone personally when I was growing up until probably about 18, that I didn't know anyone that used heroin. So I think, different fads for sure, unfortunately, with like drugs and stuff like that, and just different things for sure. But
And you mentioned poverty, and you've been shaking your head this entire time in agreement. That's there. Are there other things that you see on top of that when you talk about addiction, poverty, other things that come up to you as well?
There's one particular person who I keep thinking of. It was a youth that I worked with, but has since actually joined our team. And she lives in a Bengali culture. She grew up in Bengali, and she's an immigrant here. And it was really hard just because in their Bengali culture, those were things you didn't talk about at all. And so when I originally knew her as a youth, working with her like that, I know that she said that her parents were very, very, very reluctant to actually like even accepting any help. And so there had to be a lot of persuasion done by staff to convince her to like them to go and do treatment and things like that. And so it was like very difficult for her to have to even feel accepted by her own parents, just because that's the way she is. She can't stop. Her mental illness is not something you can just turn on and turn off like a switch. So that's just something that I always like sticks in my mind.
There seems to be, when you talk about this with people, you talk about a stigma in general, but then there's different individual communities that specifically get hit with their own personal stigmas that they have in coming over. And is this just a daily occurrence when you're dealing with peer advocacy that you have to consider all the time when you're dealing with youth?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think just being culturally competent, we always talk about that in peer advocacy work, because everyone's coming from different backgrounds, different families, and just being aware of, for example, if I walk into somebody's house and I'm doing an in-home with them, some people want me to take off my shoes and I don't take off my shoes, or, for example, accepting food versus not. Some of those things you really just have to be aware of, I think, when working with, different families. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, looks like we have a Facebook message here that I'm hearing here. It says social media, obviously, going back to that, has negative impacts as it relates to mental health, but there are some positive aspects as well. And, can you go into a little bit of detail? Are there positive aspects that you've taken away from social media using it as a tool for mental health?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, like, for example, on Facebook, I know there are a lot of different groups that you can join, and there's, like, community support groups, or, like, Tumblr. Tumblrs are really, it was big when I was younger, I don't know anymore, but Tumblr's really a post for, like, blogging and stuff. So for me, at least, that was a really good outlet, because at the time, not a lot of people I personally knew followed me, so I could really share my inner thoughts, almost like an online diary. And, just apps in general, they're coming out with so much. I know of one I always talk about with my youth. It's called Calm Harm, and it's really, really great in the way that for anyone who identifies with dealing with self-destructive behaviors, it goes through different coping skills, release, distraction, emotion expression, all of that. So I think, the outlet where you can meet a community of people for sure, and almost join like a virtual support group, and then also the different apps.
Yeah.
Different pages you can follow. I know, like, I follow To Write Love on Her Arms on Facebook, and every now and again I'll just see on my timeline there'll just be like a little post and be like, I'm glad you're here today, and it's like,
Thank you.
Yeah, it makes you feel so good just to see something so simple like that, though. It'll just give you a little boost. I know that, like, when it comes to social media, it really depends on what you're looking for. Like if you're looking to be depressed, you're going to find stuff that'll make you depressed. If you're looking to feel positive and hope, you're going to find it. You just have to weed through stuff. So like you have to want to find the positive stuff to find it.
So it's a certain way we use the tool, essentially, of social media. And that comes with a certain level of media literacy that comes with that too, which we all are learning as we talk about how fast these things change. That's big thanks to Ryan for that question. We have another one from Facebook. This is Beth, and she asks, do you have suggestions for teens who feel like something is not right but are not comfortable talking to their parents?
I would suggest, we have a teen peer support group that, is for ages 13 to 18, depending on where you are falling in that. If there's like a 19-year-old that's in high school, we say, come on in. But getting a part of like a teen peer support group is definitely important, or maybe a school counselor. Just to have that kind of mediator is really important. For me, I remember growing up, and when I was having problems at home, like with my parents, I would talk about it with my counselor, and then I would bring my parents into the session, and we'd almost have like a family session. But it was really detrimental to, the environment at home. So.
Yeah, and that talks about too, when you're dealing with this issue, you're not talking about just having time to talk about it with a counselor at school and things like that. It's kind of it's a treatment of the whole, right? Yeah. So how do you approach that specifically at home? What would your recommendation be for somebody who's a little bit younger that's dealing with this, and that stuff's not going well, and my mom's not going to have any of this right now?
Yeah. I would say don't bottle any emotions. Find any way you can to express them, even if it's not through verbally. Art is a great way, music's a great way, journaling, poetry, they're all really good outlets if you can't actually say what you need to say. And just finding other supports that are not necessarily your parents. If there's another family member who, like a really cool aunt or something that you prefer instead, who you can trust to say that they won't go straight to your parents, or if it's any friends at school, any teachers, if there's any other places that you get support from, like coaches with sports and things like that, definitely are good places to start. And if you don't have any supports that you can think of, that's when we offer like the community support groups for anyone to come to. Like your parents don't have to be there if they don't want to be. They can just drop you off, things like that.
We're going to get back to some of the services that you offer for some peers a little bit, but we do have another Facebook. We got getting good activity on Facebook right now. People
Awesome.
are interested in this topic. Let me tell you, thank you to Beth for the previous question, but I want to ask, this one's from Anne, and she asks, what are some ways teachers could help in this situation? There's teachers have a lot of responsibilities in today's age, and what's something a teacher can do to help with some of these issues? Okay,
so I always had very, very big issues when it came to school, meaning I refused to go to school. I was given an IEP, or individualized education plan, to help kind of bring me back and reintegrate me back into the school. So I'm sure that my guidance counselor was talking with all the teachers at the time, and they were very nice when I came to school for like a day, but they never actually like pulled me aside to have a conversation with me. I feel like they thought they were like walking on eggshells type of thing. Like they thought I was very fragile. They thought I was gonna break, or they thought maybe I was gonna get really offended if they say, hey, I know what's going on. But I think that they should be willing to say, even if they're not comfortable asking the student exactly, like what's going on, how can I help you? But even just saying, I'm here if you ever wanted to talk. My room's always open. You can come in during a free period. And if you ever just wanted to chat, I'm available for that. And I don't think I really got that from many of my teachers.
Yeah, so I had a teacher, his name was Mr. Graham, and he was fantastic because he knew my older sister, and, the first day, we don't share the same last name. So, I always say, hey, do you know my sister? And so he knew that she had previously gone through some stuff. So he, on his own came up to me and said, hey, if you ever need to talk, And so I would just go to him in my free periods, and he would just sit there and he would listen. He wouldn't have any input. Maybe, if I was doing something destructive, like he'd be like, Kaitlyn, really? Do you think that's a great idea? And I'd be like, probably not. But, being an outlet for sure. And then also just being aware of the signs too, I think is really important. So if a student is disengaged, if a student is maybe not taking care of themselves, like hygiene, for example, if a student is not completing their homework or always has excuses, if they're absent a lot, those are really big signs, just to kind of go by and to follow through with, and just check in on the student. If you don't feel comfortable, maybe referring them to the school psychologist or the counselor, or even just giving a call at home and saying, hey, I noticed that Michael is, he's been absent a lot and he's not really turning in his homework, and just kind of relaying it back to the parents too, because sometimes the parents don't know either.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes up, especially when you talk to kids, right? I don't show up to school, I don't do my homework, right? That's all of a sudden now you kind of dig yourself a hole, and punishment ideally is supposed to come from that, and you're dealing with that. Is there a balance between that for teachers and administrators and counselors to be able to find that nice spot where it's we can have this conversation. I understand why this isn't happening. It is, or does sometimes it not go? Sometimes is it handled in not the best way possible, I guess to say, from experiences you've had with youth recently?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think too that, really if there are some behaviors that are going on in the classroom, or, that are affecting the classroom, I think asking the student, like we said, I remember I got suspended from school when I was in 11th grade. I showed up to a school dance drunk. Why I thought that was a great idea at the time, I don't know. But I did it, and it's over. I got suspended for 5 days. There was never a follow-up with the school counselor, with anyone. I remember sitting in the principal's office like, this is so out of your character, what's going on? And I just remember crying to my mom, like, I was just trying to, enjoy myself, and this was the only way I knew how to. And so, we dealt with it at home, but I really would have liked for, a follow-up and just been like, hey, that's, like you said, it's out of your character. But she never was like, why? So I think that would have been nice.
I think it also depends on the school too, because some schools can be more forthcoming and open about mental health, and some are absolutely not. I know that with the new law this past, or like last year, that had to incorporate mental health curriculum in all the schools. This year, they never actually set like a minimum of what that could be. And so I would ask actually some of the youth, like, what have you noticed in your school? And they'll be like, well, it was one class in health class out of the entire year, and that was it. And so it depends partially, I guess, on administration and what they are willing to do for this school. Like, I know Hamburg School District, they're like really trying to be on top of things. They got a grant to do a lot of mental health work. They had like all the teachers trained in mental health first aid. They had Kevin Hines come and speak at the school for the youth and the parents at the end of the day. And so I know like they're really trying to push normalizing mental health and offering help. So it really depends on that as well.
And you speak a little optimistically there. Do you feel like it's getting better?
Yeah, it depends.
I think people are trying, but how much, we don't know. So I think this new mental health law, so we're a part of it too, so we had a little bit of a say in the Say Yes grant that's going around Buffalo Public Schools. So we're really trying to push for like presentations talking about mental health awareness, our peer advocacy role, and then also peer support groups in the schools. So we recently just did one in performing arts. I think we were getting one started at Baker, and then Burgard, I think. But
potentially next year, I think.
Yeah. So I think they're trying. How hard, we don't know.
Yeah. So I want to talk about something that, if somebody is listening and watching out there, is something that's hard to tackle sometimes, and that's just trying to find a stable point in their life. And coming from two people who are so well spoken now here today and work with youth all the time, let me ask you, how do you work at keeping yourself in a position where you are stable in your everyday day to life?
So self-care is like so important. We're always talking about self-care in our meetings and whatever else. So for me, self-care looks like making sure that I'm taking my medication. I still go to outpatient therapy. I'm still on medication. And I'm just having fun. Finding the reason why I love doing this is just helping other people, and I love youth and I love, kids, but just reminding myself that, I'm making a difference, and just having fun outside of work with my friends and my family is super important for me, at least.
Yeah, I know when it comes to self-care, for me, it's like I need the downtime to actually just kind of decompress and like process through the day. I know if it's been a particularly hard day or hard group with the youth, I need like someone to vent to. So my mom's a really good like, well, what's that called? Or like a sounding board or something where you could just say everything to it and.
Like a brick wall?
No, because she listens, but like
right.
it's not like she'll just sit to listen. And she doesn't really need to put in her input. I just need to get it out.
Yeah.
And so I can do that, and I know I have her to rely on. And then I also rely on my coworkers as well, because I do experience burnout a lot. I take on a lot of responsibility because I can't say no for some reason, and it's very hard for me to say no. So I'll just say yes, and then realize too late that, oh no, I shouldn't have said yes to this. And so I know my coworkers have always been able to step up and help me out, and I've always very much appreciated it. Because I think I would have like shut down if I didn't have it.
And so I want to just follow up with that. When you're talking about this as you're growing, is this something that it's constantly in your mind? This is something that's still a bit of a battle as you're going through while you do some of these things?
Yeah, I'd say it's much better than it has been. I usually like to describe with youth about like when they're doing like scales from 1 to 10 based on how they're feeling. And like, how do you feel when you're feeling well? A lot of them are like, well, I haven't felt well in years, so I don't know what that's like. So I usually talk about like a baseline level. And so like mine is like a 3, because there's always a little bit of underlying anxiety. There's always a little bit of depression kind of just mulling around there. But I consider that's my normal, and I'm okay with that. And so I still do struggle. Sometimes I have those days where I just don't get out of bed. But I always have to remind myself, okay, as long as you're getting out of bed the next day, otherwise then we're going to have to start making calls, and then just making sure I'm going to my appointments because I still take medication, and making sure if there's any things that need to be adjusted there, definitely helps too.
We're going to wrap things up here, but first, before we do anything else, I want to make sure that you can share what your organization is and where somebody could go if they're younger and they want to reach out to you to talk to some peer advocates who have been through this process.
Yeah, so our organization is called the Mental Health Advocates of Western New York. We're located on the corner of West Utica and Delaware. Our phone number is 886-1242, and you can actually reach us, the peer advocates, at extension 345, or peer support at mhawny.org. We have plenty of groups: art groups, teen group, 20-something group, parent group, family group, whatever group you want, we got it. Writing, I live by it, honestly. So, just always, we're going to be in the office tomorrow. Give us a call. But yeah.
That's absolutely great. Thank you so much, Kaitlyn, Julianna. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you talking with me today. And with that, I do want to add, support for the WBFO Mental Health Initiative is provided by the Patrick P. Lee Foundation. And I would like to end with saying that our TV maintenance manager, Fred Grodzinski, he's been working at WNED for almost 43 years. If there was something broke, he found a way to fix it, and this is going to be his last production with us. So Fred, thanks so much for all your hard work over the years and for helping us bring to life things like this and conversations with wonderful people like this. Big thank you to Fred, and thanks for everybody who's watched. I'm Nick Lippa. Thanks for listening.